Hello Pepperdine, I'm Sienna Jackson with Apolitical. Today our guest is Phoebe Gan, the founder and president of the Chinese Students Association. We're going to talk today about Chinese currency manipulation and the American manufacturing market. Phoebe, thank you for joining us today. First I want to go over what the situation is with Chinese manufacturing and the currency manipulation and what the Senate bill that was passed very recently with a lot of bipartisan support means for American manufacturers.
Well, the Senate bill that recently passed that you mentioned that had large bipartisan support focuses heavily on China and its manufacturing, mostly due to the fact that in 2009-2010, China became the second largest economy, surpassing Japan. From that, the United States has seen a huge shift since World War II. And whereas at the end of World War II, the United States had 50% of the world's GDP, today it has 22%. And China, I believe, is following with a close 10%. So from that, you've seen the United States as a world hegemony start to shift power, and the power has gone to other states, not just necessarily China. The United States has had a culture of American exceptionalism as well as the American can-do attitude. The Americans had the Model Ford T car as well as other products, but since then America has seen a shift of manufacturing to other countries, particularly in East Asia, because labor is cheap and is very efficient, and that is something very hard to compete with Americans having very good labor laws, which is good in the sense that for human rights, but at the same time it is bad in the sense for manufacturing, because there is a certain minimum wage that must be paid to the laborer, whereas in China there are very lax labor laws. So
to the point where the foreign labor is getting really abused. I see a lot.
Yeah.
I see a lot of cases where even now in China we have mass labor at a really cheap cost. It's basically slave labor.
Yes.
And I've seen stirring signs that even in China there is a beginning job crisis, a housing bubble in Beijing, and consumer inflation has skyrocketed to the point that the Chinese people can't buy rice or pork, which are the staple foods. So what's good for the Chinese government in terms of manufacturing and getting an edge in gross domestic product is really bad for the Chinese people in general.
And I think it's also very difficult for the American people, because obviously we see the economic crisis and high unemployment rates, and then obviously all Americans want to have jobs. I mean, it is very important to have economic stability, but at the same time they aren't willing to work for a lower wage because it isn't humanitarian, it isn't safe in a lot of cases. And then at the same time, they want products that are cheap and accessible. And so it kind of is a contradiction in the actions, is that you want the product at a cheap price, but at the same time, you don't want the labor to be in a place where you can get the product for a cheap price. It is a little difficult to juggle it, I think. But the American people with the Senate bill, they've also even suggested higher tariffs on Chinese products. And I'm not sure exactly what I think about it. I do think it is very good for the American people, but at the same time, we have to realize how globalized the economy is. So in time that the American people, they want to put these tariffs, they have to be willing to set up manufacturing themselves, and they have to be willing to take the higher prices. And that is something for the American people to decide on their own if they're willing to make that sacrifice.
Yeah, I think that will work out in the end. I think that the Senate bill is a step in the right direction. For people who don't know, basically what the Senate bill that was recently passed does is impose on the Treasury Department the command that basically, if the Chinese are manipulating their currency, we need to impose tariffs on Chinese products and make American manufacturers more competitive in the global market. Interesting story that came out of the passage of the Senate bill was this interesting profile piece in the New York Times where they were talking about an American manufacturer, like a small business, and they were in green technology. And because of the Senate bill, they were starting to bring jobs back to the United States. They had 33 employees in the U.S., 450 in China. And that's a huge disparity in employment. And I think that the thing that's really concerning about the way the Chinese government has gone about making themselves more competitive is that they are rapidly expanding their government, and this is they're making very good choices for their government, but it's on the backs of their people, and their people are suffering for the choices that the Chinese government has made.
So recently, China, their level of growth has started to wane a bit, which is starting to be a little bit worrisome for the Chinese government, because they're trying to see if they can manipulate their currency further to help launch their growth again. But at the same time, I feel like it really does actually affect the education of the children.
Oh.
Because a lot of the laborers, they cannot afford to send their children to a state registered school, so they send to unregistered schools, which the government has started to crack down on. And because of that, a lot of the children, they don't have an education, and their parents have to return to the countryside, and they're no longer to be able to make the wages that they would in the city.
Let's hope that we continue to see some positive steps in the right direction in both regions, and let's hope that the change happens fast enough that it all occurs before everything goes into the toilet. Thank you so much, Phoebe, for being here and talking with us. That was Phoebe Gan, the founder and president of the Chinese Students Association. This has been Apolitical with Sienna Jackson. Thank you very much, Pepperdine.